This is Dueling Pistols, where history draws first and legends never die. No fluff, no filters, just raw stories of grit, blood, and legacy. Triggered by Black Flag. All right, welcome back to the show. I am your host, Brian Call. I'm joined by my brother, Brent Call. How are you, Brent?
Well, thank you.
We're getting right back into our story, the book, Blood and Thunder, the epic story of Kit Carson and the conquest of the American West, written by Hampton Sides. Remember, we left off last time with a brutal uprising. The New Mexicans / Indians were like, no more Americans, we're done with you. And they brutally killed Charles Bent, the governor of Santa Fe. Mm-hmm. Also Kit Carson's father-in-law, I believe, or close friend. And Josepha, Carson's wife, was in the house when that happened. They shot his face full of arrows. He ran back into the house. The mob was outside. They climbed in. They chased him down, and then they brutally murdered him in front of his wife and kids. And miraculously, the kids and his wife weren't killed. Josepha snuck out, survived, but a lot of Americans that lived in Taos and assumed that it was a peaceful town now, and everybody kind of had reconciled, and this was ruled by the Americans. They all did a revolt and killed a lot of Americans. And then, of course, the Army of the West came rolling back through from California, and everyone found out what had happened, and they basically tried all the Pecos Indians, and remember, they shot them up out of that church and the adobe, fortresses on the hillside. They rooted them all, they killed them all. And a lot of them they hung, including the one who had killed Charles Bent. Short hanged him off of a plank out of a wagon, and restored the peace. So it didn't end well. There's a lot of stories about it. I'm sure, history is written by the victors, so it is what it is. But we read through that, and now what happens next is there's a little bit of relative peace. Carson hooks up with Josepha. He spends a little time in Taos. He gets through to basically St. Louis in Missouri. He goes back east, and when he's back east, he sees Thomas Benton. And Thomas Benton is a senator, and
not to be confused with the recently murdered Charles Bent.
Correct.
Yeah, don't get that confused, folks.
So Thomas Hart Benton, he was in St. Louis, and he's a senator, and he is also the father-in-law of John C. Fremont. So Fremont is the explorer that's been with Carson since the beginning. Fancies himself as, he's the, he's kind of the leader of this ragtag party. Carson is his, his scout, guide. And then Fremont is the intrepid explorer who, goes out. And anyway, they've had their adventures, right? And they were right there when California was, taken over. And so Fremont, his father-in-law is this Thomas Bent fellow who's a senator. And his Fremont's wife is Jessie Benton Fremont. Her name is Jessie. And Carson goes back, spends time with the senator, with Benton, spends time with Jessie, hangs out. And Jessie is kind of she's the classic senator's daughter, right? She's not the most attractive woman in a lot of ways, but her character and personality and her shine is so undeniable that even though physically the book says she doesn't have the best structure, face is a little round, nose a little long, all that. People were just drawn to her and adored her, and she was quite pretty in an Ichabod Crane kind of way on a girl. And she's just go. There's a lot of suspicion that, in fact, Fremont's, a lot of his success and the things about him were actually written by his wife. She's quite the writer and reader of stuff and the to-do person in town. And she's, her father is the senator. So she hangs out with Kit, and talk about, he's kind of smitten with her because she's everything he doesn't have a clue about. And she really takes him under her wing in the big city. And she reads books that are written about Carson by various novelists and stuff, and he's just kind of like, people write this about me? But he's also kind of flattered, but also moved by some of the stories about him. He also kind of gets a little bit of a head on himself, but then he kind of checks it and is like, I'm just, wow. I guess I'm unique, but I'm also just a dude out here like other dudes. I don't know.
This does not change what I'm already doing in any way, shape, or form, but it's cool, I guess.
He didn't know how to handle it, right?
Yeah.
In summary, it was a very awkward time. But just know that Jessie is out over there kind of crafting her husband and Carson's image in social circles and with the presidency and all of that. Carson is able to go and see his daughter. His daughter, remember, he had brought his daughter back east to be with his niece. And he had given her up. And then his other daughter, he left with the Indians and she died. And so I believe, so he has one daughter still living though. And she's educated. He hasn't seen her in 5 years. He gives her a bunch of gifts and visits and stuff. You know, this is Sarah Polk, who is, I believe, the president's daughter. You know, James Polk is the president of the United States right now. More happens under his presidency than by any. I mean, he completely changed the face of the United States during this window. But it says that Sarah Polk observed that while Carson got along fine with Marcy Buchanan and the other men, he seemed awkward, tongue-tied even. In his few conversations with the women at the party, Miss Polk wrote, he remained the soul of diffidence with the ladies and replied to us in so few words as to indicate that our interest disturbed his peace of mind. When I asked him to describe for our edification how he eluded the Mexicans when carrying dispatches to San Diego, he grew red-faced. He red in the face and would not speak. To his relief, Carson's time in Washington was drawn to a close. Within a few days, the lieutenant would be on a train bound for Baltimore, wearing the crisp new uniform, his mail pouches bulging with dispatches addressed to Brigadier General Stephen Watts Kearny in California. Okay, so he's headed back to California. So that's sort of the sequence of events that have occurred. Now we're going to get right back into the story here, with a whole new, what happens next. Now that we sort of have the Mexicans dealt with and we own, what do we have left, Brent? Who else lives in the area?
The Indians?
Yeah.
Those Pueblo Indians or just like Cherokee Indians? Or just
not
Indians?
The Cherokee, bro. Those are all the way back east in New York.
Not Cherokee, you know what
the Navajo.
Navajo, thank you.
How offensive are you? You're acting like all the Indians are the same. Some Cherokees like, what? And some Navajos going, how could you? Here we go. Just after dawn, an army of nearly 400 troops left Fort Marcy and marched through the slumbering capital of Santa Fe. They were aiming for the blue swell in the western distance, a ragged volcanic massive known as the Jemez Mountains. On that crisp morning in the late summer of 1849, the men moved through high desert air that was radiantly clear and cool, the night monsoons having swept away the atmospheric dust. The Jemez were 20 crow miles away, rising steeply from the parched mesas beyond the green declivity of the Rio Grande, but in the morning freshness, the mountain seemed close enough to touch. They had pinyon, juniper. They're cloaked in bands of ponderosa pines and quaking aspens. Lava flowed out in rocky, old lava, like lava fields flowed out and eroded banks off the mountain.
Like active lava fields?
No.
Or just like old okay.
ones, that are grown over and stuff. A series of narrow escarpments were there. It was just, it just had the signs of an ancient volcanic eruption. That's what the
book's trying to say.
Yeah. For the soldiers now leaving Santa Fe, the Jemez loomed as a magnificent but vaguely unsettling landscape. Summer's lightning storms nearly always came from that direction. In the afternoons, the clouds would build up and blacken on the Jemez, and then tails of virga would drop from the mounting thunderheads as they snarled east toward Santa Fe. So beyond the Jemez volcano was a kind of American Canaan, like from the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
A wilderness, pure and mythic, right? Like no one knew, stretching out for hundreds of miles, the land of Cain. It was the country of the Navajo. On this morning, on August 16, 1849, the U.S. Army was striking for the first time into the very heart of the Dene world, in what would be the first true reconnaissance of the Navajo lands. 3 years had passed since Kearny's conquest and Doniphan's initial foray into the Navajo country, and little had changed in the new territory with respect to the wild tribes. Remember that crew that went in, partied with the Indians, didn't actually get killed, and then left, surrounded by thousands?
Some people, I don't understand that instance and the instance of Charles Bent and his kids getting away.
Mm-hmm.
it's just like in war, the guy next to you gets shot and you don't. It's just like one of those crazy, like,
they could have just been wiped out and disappeared. Yeah. It's weird.
Bizarre.
Timing,
yeah.
The state of terror that Kearney vowed to correct still persisted. Remember, he said, look, I'm going to come in. I'm going to take over these areas. Give us your land. Turn away from the Mexican government who doesn't protect you anyway.
We're going to do
it better, and we'll get all your ancient enemies to either make peace or we wipe them out. And that was the rule. And so, of course, the Indians were never, it's like trying to hold back the tide of the ocean. Like the cultures were so vastly diametrically opposed in terms of how to live. The idea of civilization and the idea of farming and
animal husbandry
that the Indians found slavish and disgusting and not free and wild like an animal, like
being tied down to a single spot for the rest of your life,
or that you could own land. How arrogant are you? You're just part of the wilderness like everything else.
What do you do? Hold it forever?
And whatever's the strongest gets to stay there, basically. That's why I find that some of a lot of the native attitudes at this time were like, well, yeah, we get it. We can't beat these guys, but here they are. That's the sort of the situation we're in here. The state of terror that Kearney said he'd stop was still going on, even though the United States was spending $3 million a year to maintain an army of Indian fighters in New Mexico.
Dang.
The raiders continued to come in the night, and they stole with impunity, sometimes right under the noses of American soldiers. Jacarilla Apache, Mescalera Apache, Ute, Comanche, Kiowa, all the wild tribes, either singly or in various shifting alliances. And these are interesting. The Apache and the Comanche, I've read about those Indian groups as of late.
Comanches were the scary ones, right?
Pretty much.
Like those are like the scariest, scary, the boogeyman of the West.
The Apache were ghosts. And the Comanche were like super violent horsemen. The Comanche are sometimes compared to the Mongolians on the Mongolian steppe.
I was just thinking that they got a little bit of Mongolian vibe to them.
Yep.
Kill them all, stack the skulls, and let the next town come, and
in fact, if you look up some videos, you'll find, probably on YouTube or so, you'll find videos that kind of ask the question: would the Comanches or would a band of Comanches and the Mongolians, how would they go if they went up against each other? Because there's some similarities. The Comanche were basically a sort of redheaded stepchild, abused Indian tribe. This is what I have read. Okay. For a long time, they were kicked around and beat up by other Indian tribes, especially the Apache. And it made them weak, small, bitter. And then they got a hold of horses, and they observed the Spanish with the horses. They learned to ride horses. They mastered horsemanship unlike any other tribe, like unbelievable horsemanship skills. And there are accounts written of Comanche saying that off of a horse, they are scrawny, kind of pathetic looking, not very, they're slovenly. They look a little fat and chubby, like skinny fat, all of that. But then they're like, but on a horse, they look like elves, like from Lord of the Rings. They look like some sort of elite warrior, fluid with the horse, scary on their horses, right? And they had mastered this way of shooting under the neck of the horse, or so they would hide behind the horse and use it as a shield and shoot from the horse.
They'd wrap their legs around the neck, right?
Something like that. And then they'd shoot under the head of the horse. And they had a way of timing the jump of the horse to shoot in between the jump.
They're shooting in between when the feet aren't touching the ground.
Correct.
So it's galloping, do-doot, do-doot, do-doot. And in between the doot, they're letting fly.
And they're insane accurate.
And that's like, you're talking do-doot, do-doot, like seconds. Depending how fast the horse is going.
Yeah.
And then after you shoot, you got to get back up on top of the thing. So they're the spider monkeying around this thing while they're shooting.
Yeah, there's something scary about what's written about their abilities on the horse, right? And the Comanche were so embittered too, and picture them as the picked on Indian tribe, that as they got power, what they do with it? they violently took it out on their enemies. All the payback was a bitch. And they really whooped on the Apaches a lot and other tribes, and really became their rise was sudden. Like, I think over a few decades, they went from kind of the nobody tribe to the king tribe. Took away lands. They would sometimes ride 100 miles, it says, like into certain places, and then just grab another horse and ride another 100 miles. So their range was that they could cover as a tribe was massive, because they had groups and new horses in new places. And so they could basically control huge portions of country and keep other
just a
Indians
little
out.
bit of technology, man. Go a long way.
It shifted. Yeah, they learned. They got ahead of everybody on the horse thing. They bred their own horses, figured out horses. The other Indians just stole horses. That's what they did. The Comanche figured out how to breed horses. And
so they had superior horses than everybody.
They had better horses too. They kept the ones that were the intelligence, and as they bred and bred and bred to develop better and better horses, they became more and more dangerous. The Navajo are also
very much
phenomenal.
Mongolian.
The Navajo are phenomenal horsemen as well. They live more in that other region that's more rock and severe desert. But the Comanche were brutal. The things that they did to people, stories of them cutting arms and legs off of an enemy and then cutting their tongue out too, but cauterizing it so they don't die, and then like putting them, on the ground and then stacking wood on them and then lighting it on fire. And then they're being cooked alive as their meat is cooked and they're dripping fat onto the fire and they're screaming, but they can't run away because they have no arms and legs. And yeah, it's like horrific things like that. And they all laughed and kind of hung out about it. And a lot of Comanche boys, are brought up at such a young, that kind of stuff is just that cruelty and that degree of inhumane behavior is just second nature. It's just kind of like, it's hard to pinpoint, where you put a Comanche, given that they're that animalistic in a way. Like that's some dark stuff. The Apache were also scary. You
can't live with someone next to you like that. Like there's no cohabitating. There's no reasoning with them. If you're going to live next to them, one of you's got to buckle or get et. Like it's just like.
Well, there was another tribe there, the Katawana or whatever, that was accused of being cannibals. And they wore people's fingers around their necks and like some serious cannibalism that was egregious levels of cannibalism.
You ever seen those little candy necklaces? You just.
Yeah.
Little finger bites.
Yeah, it was just, so there's lots of this, right? So the Comanche were what they were. The Apache were ghosts and much more on foot. They still rode horses, of course, but there's stories of Comanche disappearing. Like they were the masters of the Apaches, I should say, the masters of just disappearing. You turn your back, you turn around, they're gone. They could bury themselves in the sand in seconds, minutes. They could.
So the Apaches are ninjas and the Comanches are Mongolians. Okay.
You got it.
We're getting this.
You got it. So
a little word association goes a long way with me.
The Apache are scary in their own way too, just because they're invisible. You can hear them whistling to each other and doing things. They're those Indians that come out in the movie and you're just like, where are they? I know they're here. And they pop up out of the ground and like out of nowhere. They're just incredible. They prided themselves on disguise and stuff like that. So I believe Geronimo was an Apache. Anyway, that was kind of a tangent, but I thought you'd find it interesting, and it adds some context as people are learning about this time frame and what's going on. Okay. So, it says that, the raiders continued to come at night and they stole with impunity, sometimes right under the nose of American soldiers. Like I said, Jicarilla, Apache, Mescalero, Apache, Ute, Comanche. Now, Ute, aren't they Shoshone?
Shoshone.
We'll come back to that. The Kiowa and all the wild tribes, either singly or in various shifting alliances, right? But the Navajos remained the most cunning and brazen of all. That spring, thefts and murders had reached a new frenzy. Scores of raids were reported up and down the Rio Grande, and many thousands of head of sheep had vanished. In truth, many of these raids were carried out by Apaches, Utes, and other tribes, but the Navajos usually got the blame. The new Indian agent to the New Mexico Territory, a Georgian named James Calhoun, attempted to describe the deepening fears to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in Washington. The Navajos commit their wrongs from a pure love of rapine and plunder. Agent Calhoun wrote, "Not a day passes without hearing of some fresh outrage, and the utmost vigilance of the military force in this country is not sufficient to prevent murders and depredations. There are but few so bold as to travel alone 10 miles from Santa Fe." He's talking about people in Santa Fe. The younger Navajo warriors had apparently decided that Narbona was wrong, that these quote unquote new men were no different from the Spanish and Mexicans before them, or at least that their differences were of no consequence to the patterns of Navajo life. The conquerors had bigger guns, to be sure, and better organization, but the Americans, with their cumbersome equipment and comical uniforms, were powerless to stop the fleet raiders. The soldiers couldn't successfully pursue the Navajo horsemen into their mountainous hideouts. In most cases, the Americans couldn't even find Navajo warriors, let alone punish them. The Navajo had completely ignored the treaty Alexander Donovan had concluded at Bear Springs in 1846. Of course.
No.
So this is 3 years later. Agent Calhoun believed that the Navajos and other wild Indians of this country have been so much more successful in their robbery since General Kearny took possession of the country that they do not believe we have the power to chastise them. Then Calhoun slyly posed the question, is it not time to enlighten them on this subject?
Someone's getting a little bloodthirsty.
Apparently it was. Leading this ambitious expedition into Navajo country was the new military governor of New Mexico, a career soldier with the impeccably American name of John Washington. Colonel Washington had arrived in Santa Fe in October, fresh from Monterey, California, where he had been briefly posted. 53 years old, he was a severe Virginian with a taut mouth and wispy eyebrows that sketched across the prominent forehead of his tall, thin face. A West Pointer with advanced training as an artilleryman, Washington had fought the Seminoles in Florida, participated in the forced removal of the Cherokees to Oklahoma. Cherokee Trail of Tears, Brent? They're not from the plains, and recently won commendations for valor in the Mexican War at the divisive Battle of Buena Vista. He had briefly served as military governor of Saltillo. Little is known about Washington's personality, but he was a seasoned soldier with a sober disposition. In his military correspondence, he was given to making stern pronouncements in an incongruously stately English pen in his delicate hand. So, the primary purpose of Washington's Navajo expedition was military in nature, to impress upon the Diné with the reach and might of the American army, to punish them for their continuing raids, to recover stolen livestock and Mexican slaves, and if possible, to compel the Navajos to sign a lasting treaty. As he starkly put it in one letter to Washington, he believed that ultimately the Navajo must learn to, quote, cultivate the earth for an honest livelihood or be destroyed. Yeah, become like us or you're gone.
So Washington's going to go over and flex on the Diné.
Yeah, he insisted that this tribe of nomadic herders and horsemen would have to settle down in permanent villages and be like the Pueblo. So it's time, he said.
That sounds reasonable, Brian, and like it's going to go without a hitch.
He wrote that they must, quote, become acquainted with our national strength. Colonel Washington was appalled and frustrated by the spring rampages of the Navajos in his army correspondence. One can detect his steadily rising ire. Within the last 3 weeks, he reported in July, inhabitants have been murdered and a considerable quantity of their stock run off. From their numbers and formidable character, greatly increased exertions have become necessary to suppress them. Yeah, they basically keep talking about how they need to be chastised. And so the chastisement
suppress
would begin in earnest. Most of Washington's troops were Missourians, some of the same young volunteers who had left Fort Leavenworth 3 summers earlier with General Kearny. The Missourians were toughened soldiers now, having marched the several thousand miles without respite and having tasted battle in the thorny chaparrals of Mexico. They were sent after the conquest of Santa Fe.
So they are on their way to chastise the Apache?
No, the Navajo.
Navajo.
So it talks about how tough the Missourians are at this point. They've been through a lot. Remember the Lansing debut with the Spaniards, stuff like that.
Yeah, with the false charge.
Yeah, this is 3 years after they signed that one treaty with Donovan. So they're schooled by experience rather rather than any formal training, and still wearing the threadbare gray trousers and their blue crush caps, they started out. And with this tattered-looking army of volunteers, despite all its appearances, they were hardened and disciplined and skilled. Plowboys have become men, wiser, more cautious, less impressionable. They're tough. They lived through it.
Mm-hmm.
They were proud of their wanderings and like to compare their foot slog through hostile country to the march of, it says, Xenophon's 10,000 Greeks following the Peloponnesian War. 500 of the Missourians had returned to Santa Fe in October, marching from Mexico back up the Camino Real and then into California, and finally with Colonel Washington marching for 77 days across the country back to New Mexico. They've been around. Yet another journey of 1,000 miles to add to their raft of adventures. So they're tough guys. So several months later, when Colonel Washington proposed his march into Navajo country, the expedition must have sounded to them like a mere stroll. Now, on this vivid August morning, as breakfast fires began to ensue, a low-carbon haze over the compounds of Santa Fe and Washington, the men headed toward the Jemez with 4 companies of regular infantry, most of whom carried Model 1841 muzzle-loading percussion lock rifles. Hundreds of horses and pack mules were burdened with wooden ammunition chests and all manner of military supplies, which included linen, tents, scores of oil lanterns, medical equipment, and enough rations to feed 500 men for a month. Astride his horse, Colonel Washington wore a long blue jacket and white cloth belt set with a gleaming brass buckle, his crisp uniform trimmed in gold braid. So they had a 6-pound field gun, some mountain howitzer, bronze barrel pieces. They had this rolling artillery, and the Indians called them thunder wagons.
Thunder wagons. It's a good name.
As the August sun eased over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to warm their backs, Washington's men followed the western course of the Santa Fe River past the barrio of Agua Fria. Although it was a chiefly military campaign, Washington's expedition had a secondary and ultimately far more significant purpose. It was to survey and explore the Navajo terrain and to piece together its first reliable map. In 1849, Navajo country was terra incognita, just a black box. Only small swaths around its edges were known, and they were known only in the heads of a few old traders and trappers who had passed through in their wanderings, but they hadn't really written it down. The Spanish had gone in to try to make the Navajos pay and never really accomplished much and left or died out there, and they didn't have maps either. It was trackless, and it was as big as New England, with its own snowy mountain ranges and great drainages, its own nomenclature and quirks of geology. Because it was so vast and so unknown, many legends had welled up around it over the centuries, of hideous monsters, of beautiful temples, and impregnable citadels. Like the people who populated it, Navajo country remained a tantalizing mystery to the United States government, a question mark in a void on a map that did not exist. Imagine being an explorer like a person back then.
Mm-hmm.
You never know what you're going to find. El Dorado, gold, treasure. Like, it'd just be kind of cool to just not know.
It's lovely not knowing, but at the same time, they also know what they're walking towards right now. Like, I would be twitchy. It would be hard. Like, here's the deal, Brian. Like, it would be hard for me to truly enjoy all this knowing that there's just a group of people out there that want to scalp me. For some reason, that one, detail kind of puts a poo-poo on it for me.
But didn't they say they had 500 people?
Yes, I was going to say, that's going to help me sleep a lot better at night. That's going to feel a lot better if I'm in the middle of the camp. I'm in the middle of the camp every night.
Well,
and none of that century dude
I think
crap,
it's pretty exciting.
They get got first.
A member of the U.S. Corps of Topographical Engineers was assigned to Washington's party. His name was James Hervey Simpson. He's a West Pointer. And his task was considerable: to map and measure every slow inch of a month-long reconnaissance. Leaving Santa Fe with his barometers and sextants and viameters, Simpson was to puncture a world that had for centuries been shrouded in mist, to affix miles and temperatures, take soil samples and animal specimens, and generally fill in the vast blanks in the nation's understanding of the strange kingdom it had, on paper at least, conquered. Simpson was also expected to keep a thorough daily log of the journey, the extraordinary document he would write longhand in pen and in ink. Navajo Expedition, Journal of a Military Reconnaissance, would become one of the classics of Western exploration literature. First, James Simpson was a hirsute gnome of a fellow dismaying, mousy looking, in the words of, okay, whatever. He was bookish. A devout Episcopalian, Simpson could be, for a young man of 36 years, an annoyingly fuddy-duddy guy.
Fuddy-duddy.
He had been a child prodigy, entering West Point from his native New Jersey at the age of 15. From early on, he showed an engineering sensibility and spent much of his young Army career undertaking drainage projects in the Florida Everglades. And he worked in the Great Lakes, did improvements over there. Before coming to Santa Fe, he had never been west of the Missouri, and the east was where he preferred to stay.
Oops.
He absolutely hated the Southwest, hated the, quote, nauseating food, quote, nakedness of the long brown vistas, the untidiness of the Mexican villages, and the fine grit that seemed to work its way into everything. He wrote that the sickening colored aspect of the New Mexico terrain gave him a sensation of loathing. Perhaps it was because he'd had yet to leave his new bride back in Buffalo, but throughout Simpson's observations, a distinct whine of petulance is heard.
Yeah, Simpson puts out wet blanket vibes.
Yeah. For me, I freaking love that country.
I know, right? I was like, geez.
The desert is, I don't know. It's quiet. It's still. There's something about the desert, the heat. I love it. I love the cooler nights.
I don't think there's anything prettier than like a purple sunset in the desert. Like that.
I love areas pink. Like, if I had to choose, like, I love areas like Death Valley. They're some of the best places I've been, you know. And then I'm just like, I like Alaska, but I don't want to live there.
I couldn't do the Alaska thing, dude. Heck, nah. Nah, not even
interesting though.
seasonally.
Other people hate the desert. Lampers hates the desert, you know. Doesn't hate it.
Well, I should say, Brian, his hair probably frizzles out a bit.
I should say he just
needs the right conditioner.
Like,
it'll change.
It says, behind all of this fussiness, one is struck by the deepening intensity of Lieutenant Simpson's interest, his slow blooming fascination over an utterly foreign landscape and its equally foreign inhabitants. In spite of himself, Simpson is amazed by everything he claims to detest. The hard-baked geology, the desert flora and fauna, the odd customs of the people. The more bizarre the country becomes, the more Simpson seems to long for his familiar lighthouses back on the Great Lakes, and yet, at the same time, the more animated his prose become. Simpson would later enjoy an eminent career as an Army engineer, eventually becoming a brevet general, but the rest of his life story, according to a sympathetic biographer, frankly makes dull reading. The New Mexico Territory was what Simpson hated most, and yet New Mexico in the late summer of 1849 was the place where he made his lasting mark. So he was, he had to do this, but he was with an army who had other things to do. But he signed on for the ride. The multi-talented Richard and Edward Kern were two brothers from a large, prominent family back in Philadelphia. Edward, or Ned, as he was known, was an expedition artist. So he was a topographer and an artist. Ned had accompanied Fremont and Kit Carson on Fremont's third exploratory mission. Later, as a temporary commander of a fort near Sacramento, Kern had played a role in rescuing survivors of the Donner Party after their disastrous sojourn in the Sierra Nevada snowdrifts during the winter of 1846 and 47.
Just a hiccup.
Ned Kern was a tall, lanky man of 25, curly red hair. Says Ned was an epileptic, and perhaps because of his medical predicament, he seemed to find solace in the quiet of his western travels.
I would not be having epileptic seizures while traveling out west.
Yeah, you are. You have what you have. You don't want to fall. You don't want to go under one of those in the middle of an Indian fight.
No.
Although they might leave you alone because they think you're possessed of the devil.
Oh yeah, for real. That too.
Richard Kern, who was the older of the two brothers, Ned was the younger. He was more scientific. He was a botanist and ornithologist. That's a bird scientist. he had done numerous illustrations for technical journals. He was really skilled as well as an artist. It says that he wasn't much for hygiene or personal tidiness.
Shocker.
It says one of the weirder projects that Dick or Richard wanted to pursue while he was out west was to collect Indian skulls.
That's I wouldn't call that a healthy hobby.
In his 1839 book, Crania Americana, Dr. Morton had argued that American Indians constituted a distinct race and that their aptitude for civilization was of a decidedly inferior caste when it compared with those of the Caucasian and Mongolian races. I mean,
that's a scene into Django.
Right?
Yeah, for real. What's his face? DiCaprio has this whole thing, this whole spiel. He talks about how the Negro doesn't have the brain capacity. And it's a scientific fact, Brian. He pulls out a skull and
Right.
shows them
Jamie Foxx.
yeah.
That yeah, for sure. There's that's part of history. People have all kinds of weird theories, and at the time they're trying to prove things out. But yeah, this dude,
They just got little heads. Chill. They
Yeah.
don't have a little head.
so they're making this journey, right? The Kern brothers had been holed up in Taos for the summer and living in a stable and recovering from an ordeal in the mountains that nearly killed them. It was Fremont's fourth expedition, as the ill-fated mission was known. It was a wintertime probe into the San Juan Mountains in Colorado, southern Colorado. The Fremont expedition was a debacle of the first order, one of the most harebrained exploring expeditions ever undertaken in this country, in the words of one prominent Southwest historian. The mission was conceived in part as a way to rehabilitate Fremont's tarnished career. In California 2 years earlier, Stephen Watts Kearny's quarrel with Fremont had escalated into a full-blown standoff, and refusing to recognize Kearny's higher authority and turn the California governorship over to him as ordered, Fremont flagrantly disobeyed the chain of army command. He even challenged one of Kearny's officers to a duel. Kearny arrested Fremont finally after he got thoroughly annoyed and dragged him into irons to Washington, D.C. to stand trial for mutiny.
Dang.
The trial was a feeding frenzy for the media and a political melodrama for the first of the first order. Senator Benton roared his displeasure, remember Fremont's father-in-law, at the whole affair, arguing that his son-in-law had been unfairly caught in the crossfire of an inter-service rivalry between a jealous army and a jealous navy. In the end, Fremont was convicted on all three counts. Heeding the court's recommendation for a lenient sentence, however, President Polk ordered Fremont to return to Army service. Fremont refused, humiliated, depressed, bitter, and in poor health. He resigned in a huff and went on a damage control offensive to restore his good name. General Kearny, meanwhile, returned to the front, serving in Veracruz and then ably holding the post of military governor of Mexico City, which the United States occupied in the last lurching months of the war. Now, Kearny got stabbed brutally in the ass during that Mexican raid. A stomach in the ass or something?
Thing was in the guts.
Bad.
Yeah.
So he obviously survived that and moved on. However, it says Kearny contracted yellow fever, or the vomito, as it was more graphically known in Mexico, and soon returned to Missouri to convalesce at home with his pregnant wife, Mary, and their growing family. There is evidence that Fremont, still stewing over his court-martial, visited Kearny in St. Louis with the intention of dueling him, only to find the general on his deathbed. It is not known whether Kearny was dying of the fever itself or complications arising from it, but if it was the former, then Kearny suffered an excruciating death.
Dang.
The whites of his eyes would have turned yellow, his skin a strange luminous gold, and in his last hours he would have bled from his eyes and gums and thrown up a black vomit caused by massive internal hemorrhaging. I don't trust vaccines, but a few aren't bad.
Yeah, there's a couple tried and true ones out there,
So this was yellow fever. Is that what he said it was? Yeah. Kearny contracted yellow fever, or the vomito.
Vomito.
As
I wonder
the
what that
Mexicans
means. The vomito. That
Get
sounds
this.
like a ride at like a fair or something.
Kearney, only 54 years old and having recently been promoted to Major General, passed away on October 31, 1848, at the Missouri country home of his close friend Meriwether Clark. Only a few weeks earlier, Mary had given birth to their last child, a son named Stephen Watts Kearney. So, yeah, he died pretty early. Man, that's no way to go either. With his nemesis freshly on the ground, Fremont had hatched his plan for a fourth expedition. Goaded, as always, by Benton, his father-in-law, Fremont was determined to find a route across the Rocky Mountains for a transcontinental railway that would connect St. Louis to the Pacific. The only way to demonstrate that such a route was feasible, Fremont insisted, was to traverse it in the dead of winter. He confidently proclaimed that he would find a suitable pass and thus prove to skeptics that the Rocky Mountain snows did not pose an insurmountable obstacle for a railroad.
Was he going to put on some snowshoes?
He really...
He had no idea what that would. Yeah, that is a man who's speaking with no experience. I've seen snow before. It gets this deep. Like, get off it, bro.
Well, I think what happens in life, people, they experience success. And a lot of, let's be real, a lot, I think, of Fremont's success you can attribute to Carson. Carson was the guy, not Fremont. Fremont brought his skill set to the table. Sure. He got the expeditions underway. He was really good at documenting things and putting the maps together. And he was charismatic. He could lead people, get them to go places. But Carson was the rock and the quiet. It's the two of them together that was powerful. Carson didn't have any of the skills that Fremont had. None. Yeah. And Fremont had none of the skills deep down that Carson had. So the two together were formidable. And I think Fremont, as time went on and he made a lot of stupid mistakes in his arrogance and his, bid to, he lost a lot of popularity and he fell flat on his face. And this happens to people. They rise and they fall. Can he reinvent himself? Can he find a way out? Sometimes it's like the guy who was a multimillionaire and lost it all and then he goes, what his plan is like to gamble his way back. It's like, I'm going to sell drugs. I'll make, there's this desperate, or maybe they haven't lost it all. They just they're on the verge of losing it all. It causes a man to be much more reckless and desperate to try to do, instead of like build wealth over the next 10 years or lose some of it and salvage what you can and make smart decisions and work your way out of it over a long time. It's Hail Mary. It's now or never. I figure it out or I die. It's men get desperate when they're down to the wire like that. And where so much of Fremont's wealth and status comes from his status, right? And his reach and who he is. To lose your status has got to be devastating to your well-being, and so
his mental psyche,
I think there's just a lot of pressure, his whole identity, all of that.
Yeah.
And so the project was filled by pure hubris. He intended to follow the 39th parallel up and over the serrated San Juan Mountains, which rose more than 14,000 feet. Sorry, you ain't taking a train over that.
Or through it, or near it.
He said it was frequently lashed by brutal storms. First of all, why wouldn't you go in the non-winter, figure things out, and then go back and double check your route during the winter to see his idea is like dead of winter, and then we figure it out. It's like, what the gosh? He ignored the large chunks of ice floating in the Arkansas River as he assembled his expedition at Bent's Fort that fall. In November, with 33 men in his party, Fremont pressed toward the San Luis Valley in the snowy San Juan Mountains. By all signs, including the solemn prognostications of friendly tribes they encountered, the winter of 1848 was shaping up to be unusually bitter. Fremont scarcely even noticed the warnings. For his guide, he had wanted Carson, but instead hired a veteran trapper named Bill Williams, a 62-year-old mountain man who was recovering from a recent Indian fight that had left him with a gunshot wound in the arm. This is just all desperation. Williams was a likable crank, and he had vast experience in the Rockies, a former itinerant Methodist preacher. He was legendary for gambling and drinking binges. And he liked to dine on the raw leg of a fetal calf. He had some strange things about him. But he said he knows every inch of the San Juan Mountains. He was a friend of Carson. They had ridden thousands of miles together during their trapping days. So it says that he was pretty handy. He talked to himself a lot on the trail just as they rode around.
Does he talk to himself when he's chewing on the fetal calf leg, or only when he's out of the fetal calf leg does he start talking to himself?
It's a good question. Something is a little off.
A little. And first of all, what a freaking odd ass tick. I mean, like, there are some people, like the one's got his hand in his pocket or something like that, or like chewing tobacco or whatever, something like that. But like,
yeah,
Brian, how do you even develop a tick like that? That's not like you can just like get those kinds of things onto a fetal calf leg. You can't but just pluck that onto the man or go to the nearest store and get one.
Well, it says that some contemporaries suggested that this outrageous man at times lacked the keen judgment and instinctual caution of Kit Carson. So even though they were friends, Carson had, an instinct. He seemed to have an uncanny sixth sense, Carson did, on how to avoid calamity. On this ill-fated mission, Carson would be sorely missed.
Oh.
So Ned and Dick Kern, caught up in Fremont's peculiar charisma, had happily signed on for that expedition. They were the artists and the cartographers, respectively. They had cajoled their brother Ben, a respected Philadelphia physician, to join them as the medical doctor. Trusting Fremont, the three Kern brothers failed to see the folly of the expedition for several weeks as they marched headlong into the formidable drifts of the Rockies. But then the Kerns began to entertain doubts. On Fremont's reckless drive, Dick Kern would later write, with willfully blind eyes of rashness and self-conceit and confidence, he pushed on. As November slid into December, the snows kept coming for weeks. The party could not budge. We all looked like old winter, Dick wrote, icicles, an inch long, rependent from our mustache and beard. One night, Ned's socks froze so completely that they had to be shaved off his legs.
Shaved socks off of someone's legs?
That's what it says. By late December, their predicament turned truly desperate. Fremont's starving mules took to eating one another's manes and leather bridles and then collapsed in the impenetrable drifts. The men ate nothing but their dying pack animals and waited in vain for the weather to break. Ben Kern wrote in his diary that on the morning of December 18, he awoke beneath 8 inches of fresh snow piled on his bedroll. I told Dick the expedition was destroyed, Ben noted, and if we all got to some settlement with our lives, we would be doing well. Finally, even Fremont saw the expedition was hopeless, but by then it was nearly too late. His men had begun to freeze to death, and with the mules all eaten, they listlessly foraged for odd scraps of protein. Dick Dern jotted in his diary, too weak to move. We looked for mussels and snails and earthworms, found none. Ned Kern later recalled, gradually sinking into a sleep, I felt happy and contented, sitting nearly all day by the fire in a kind of stupor, careless of when my time would come, for I was expecting it.
Man, who could have seen this coming?
In anticipation of my death, I had written and closed all of my business. By the time they were found by a rescue party hastily organized by Kit Carson and other citizens from Taos, 11 of Fremont's 33 expeditioners had died, either of starvation or exposure. 11 of 33. That's 1/3. As in the Donner tragedy, several of the deceased were almost certainly eaten.
Ugh. How come no one's mentioned? How come they don't get a cool name? No one's been talking about them how they're eating everybody. The only one you ever hear about is the Donner Party.
The 22 frostbitten survivors straggled back to Taos, where some of them stayed at Kit Carson's home. Fremont himself was so exhausted that he had to be carried inside his former guide's house. Carson and Josepha nursed Fremont back to health, plying him with hot chocolate and listening to the shocking story of his disaster in the mountains. The ever-loyal Carson seemed constitutionally incapable of judging his former commander. Nor was he disposed to second-guess the decisions of his old friend Bill Williams, but Carson did later suggest, with characteristic wryness, that Williams, with his fiercely strange eating habits, was not a man likely to shy away from cannibalism. In starving times, Carson said, no man ever walked in front of Bill Williams. Oh.
Again, there's just some certain people
that's
you
morbid,
can't cohabitate with.
No.
For real.
the fetal leg of a calf. Yeah.
Someone met
talking
that guy
to himself.
and then invented door locks the next day. You know what I mean?
Yes. So it says, Fremont, however, refused to accept any responsibility for the fiasco or for the deaths of the 11 men he had led into the mountains. Indeed,
really? Whose
his
fault
letters
is it,
show
Brian?
no trace of remorse.
Whose fault is it?
Instead, he placed the blame entirely on Kit Williams,
Oh.
while calling many of the subordinate members of the expedition cowards and incompetents. Gathering his energies in his narcissistic pride, Fremont decided to strike out for California using the tried and true southern route along the Gila River to the Colorado, the same route General Kearny and Kit Carson had used in 1846. There would be no railroad through the San Juans. The eventual route would have to pass much farther south. Duh.
Shocked.
Yeah. Interesting. So the thing about Fremont and a man who can't own their mistakes, they can't learn.
Mm-hmm.
You know, by blaming everyone but himself, that's a narcissistic dude. And what's interesting is how Carson's sort of like, he's so loyal to Fremont for whatever reason over the years that he's going to stand by Carson or Fremont even when he knows he's wrong, which is odd, you know. A little bit of, like I said, there is, I think, such a lack of what Fremont has in Carson, and then but Fremont doesn't have that Carson has, that they sort of recognize that together they're pretty useful, but apart they don't feel, or at least Carson doesn't feel as whole. I don't know. It says that the three Kern brothers begged off. They'd had enough of John Charles Fremont and his vainglory. They waited in Taos for the Rocky Mountain snowpack to melt. Then in March, Ben Kern and Bill Williams returned to the San Juan Mountains to recover a cache of gear that they had left behind, medical equipment, their instruments, topographical, art supplies, and the like. The two men succeeded in finding their cache, but then they were set upon by bandits. So this is Ben and Bill Williams. Bill was the weird eating,
the leg eater.
So the two of them go back to get their stuff, but then they're set upon by bandits. The mystery was not entirely solved, but evidence suggests that they were murdered by Ute Indians, among whom some articles of the expedition's equipment were later discovered. According to one account, Williams was found sitting bolt upright against a tree, frozen stiff and half covered in snow, with a Ute bullet through his body. Ben Kern's corpse was never recovered.
Because he got
I don't know. Got to ask yourself if it's worth going back for that stuff. But just two dudes. I mean, I don't know. So there's three brothers, and now there's two. Still shocked by their brother's probable murder and despising John Fremont more than ever, Ned and Dick Kern recuperated in Taos, taking lodging for a time in a suite of rooms that you would say would make capital stabling, Ned wrote in a letter to his sister. So, fit for a horse. Ned described Santa Fe as a tawny adobe town with a few green trees set in a half circle of cornelian colored hills that had no more. So anyway, they're rambling on, but they got themselves hired for the next expedition, and they were with Colonel Washington now. So they went through the ringer.
Pass.
So we're going to get into the next episode. We're going to get into continuing on with Colonel Washington, and this kind of set the stage for the characters, you know, and the dudes that are on the march right now into the Navajo country. And we know the Missourians, they've been through it all. They've hiked a lot of miles. They're a lot more seasoned than they used to be. They have a new colonel, you know, because Kearny's died of yellow fever, and now we have these Ned brothers hired on and going in there. Now, Fremont is a joke at this point, and I think Carson's just back in Taos. Not sure. He's not with the army, I don't believe. So we're going to get into their march into Navajo country and what it turns into. It gets real interesting. So I hope you guys are enjoying learning about the epic story of Kit Carson, the conquest of the American West. Been fun so far. Hope you're getting some stuff out of it. We're getting deep into the next phase of how the West was conquered.
There you go.
I think you're going to enjoy hearing about what happens next. Till next time, take care. All right, folks, I hope you're enjoying the Dueling Pistols podcast. If you like it, do us a favor and share it with a friend. Help us get this thing to grow a little bit bigger. Tell your dad, your mom, your brother, your sister, your buddy, your uncle.
Go to
your
contacts,
grandpa.
hit select all, send.
Just sell it. Just share it with a friend of yours, somebody, and help us spread the word about the show. Thanks for supporting us. We'll catch you on the next episode.